I did downstairs, saying thank you so much for being here. What Dana left out was the reason I laughed, and the reason I said you could have left out the whole bishop part, even though I love our bishop and consider him a friend and a mentor, is that Jessica is not only a good friend of mine, she is also the godmother of both of my children. And so that was just like, you could have said that from the beginning. I have a responsibility now. If anything happens to me, she's on the hook, so I got to show up whenever her name is brought. That's pretty much the deal. But this is something I look forward to for almost a year. And the reason for that is for a couple of reasons. One, my wife is from Louisville and a U of L fan, so anytime I step foot on this campus, it's like rubbing it in, and I get away with it because I'm doing the Lord's work. What are you going to do? But when we began to talk about this topic of social justice and being a person of faith, it really almost took me the entirety of the time since we began having this conversation to really center on some things that I wanted to talk about. And the great thing about, for me, and my faith walk, is I'm 33, so I tend to look at the things and the way that my life is operated, and I'm never on Colmon time. That's pretty much what I've always submitted myself to. And some of the things that have happened since we began initially this conversation have almost overshadowed anything that I would have talked about a year ago, and have really given focus to some things, really tested my faith walk, and if I truly, as a public servant and as a Christian, as a person of faith, can not only talk the talk but walk the walk. And so for me, I'm humbled by God's timing, and all things always happen when they are supposed to. And I want to thank you all for being here, because you don't have to be here. And the fact that you are here tonight, and the fact that you are consistently engaged in the mission of this place speaks to who you are as individuals, but who or what you aspire for your legacy to be as students here, and as members of the Lexington and Fayette County and surrounding area family and community. I cannot begin talking about social justice, about being a person of faith, without telling you a little bit about me. And so I always say you have to know a little bit about me, and knowing what I do for a living is great. And I will tell you, the great part about the role that I've had in the past 8 years is you always get your calls returned. I was talking to some of the young men about where they're from, and especially those who are from Kentucky. I've been to all 120 counties multiple times. The difference I have found since I left the governor's office is there's a difference when you can jump on a plane in Frankfurt and go to Paducah, and when you have to drive. I learned the other day, I was giving another speech and had to get to Louisville, and Louisville is in the midst of a lot of construction because of the Bridges project. And I forgot about the fact that I hadn't been to Louisville since I left the governor's office. There's no such thing as traffic when you're in the governor's office. You have troopers who turn on lights, and then you just go. And so there's been a humbling of reality since I left the governor's office. But one of the more traumatic things, I don't mean traumatic necessarily in a bad way, but what I learned after leaving the governor's office is that so many people conflated the role that I've had in these past 8 years with who I am. And really did not understand that I have always had a very good understanding of who Colmon Elridge is outside of being the executive assistant and senior advisor to the governor, and who I am in that role. And what I mean by that, and I hate talking about myself in the third person, is that the person who I am, what makes me tick, who I am, was shaped long before I got the phone call from Steve Bashir to come. And really, the the journey, both professionally and personally and as a person of faith, was to maintain that person through everything that I knew I would be experiencing over the course of the governor's tenure, and even some things that I didn't know I was going to experience. And so there's this idea that because you have this role, that you all of a sudden are either untouchable or the spawn of Satan, depending on what your politics are. And so that's why I feel very keenly about telling you a little bit about me. When I think about faith, I am a Christian, but that wasn't a given. And my mother, if she were here, would roll her eyes because she would both recoil at me admitting that and say and admit readily that I really never asked permission as I was seeking out other faiths. This is a true story. When I was 9, before we moved to Kentucky, we moved to Kentucky from San Antonio. My church, New Mount Rose Baptist Church in San Antonio, was right across the street from a synagogue. And one day I just felt compelled as a 9-year-old to sneak out of church and go across the street to the synagogue. And my mother freaked out, as any good parent would, because she didn't know where I was. And finally she goes across the street to ask if they've seen me, and they all start laughing because I'd been there. And what she did not realize was that I had snuck out, that I just got caught that time. I'd actually been going over there for a long time. We'd have Bible school and I'd sneak out and I felt as though everyone knew that, if I wasn't there, I was across the street. You've not met my mother, but that was the worst life decision I could have made. So then we moved to Kentucky, and I guess I should back up. My father died when I was 3, and my father was Catholic, and my mother is a Baptist. And so to confuse us, my mother made us go to Catholic school during the week. So we went to Mass Monday through Friday, and then got a break on Saturday, and then on Sunday we spent every living moment at Mount Rose Baptist Church. And so I felt like I got the best of both worlds. But when we moved to Kentucky, I still was in this church. I knew what my faith was, but I also understood that there was a broader world, and my curiosity got the best of me. And so one day we were in Kroger in Lexington, and we ran into a Jehovah's Witness, and I invited him to dinner. Again, unbeknownst to my mother. And so I'll never forget this day. It was a Tuesday. We were having tuna fish sandwiches, and the doorbell rings, and it was this man named Stephen. And his friend, I believe his friend's name was Fred. I remember Stephen, I believe it was Fred. And my mother kind of looks because she wasn't expecting anybody, and she goes and she answers the door, and he says, is Colmon home? And of course, grown men asking if your 10-year-old is home raises a lot of alarms. And so she said, well, yes, but who are you? And he said, we were invited by Colmon to dinner to talk about our faith. And my mother just kind of rolled her eyes, but they had driven all the way to Indiana. So why not? And what she began to understand about me was that even though I was comfortable in my Christian faith, I had a desire to understand the role that other faiths played in making up this world that we lived in. And one of the things that she recounted to me actually at my son's soccer game tonight was, at 10 years old, I made this following statement to her, that I hated the word tolerate. I never wanted to tolerate other religions. I never wanted to tolerate other cultures. I wanted to understand other religions and understand other cultures. And even though I may not ascribe to all of the tenets of their faith and all of the tenets of their culture, having an understanding of where they're coming from made me better in my own walk. So you have to understand that about me, to understand how I have seen my role in politics and in government, which are two totally different things. I know there's some poli-sci majors out here, and I always say, politics for me was always the means to an end to get to government. And I like politics, and I'm pretty good at it. But if you make me choose, I'd always err on the side of government. Social justice came to my attention again, personally, and through my faith. When I was little, I was born in California, and when my father died, we moved to San Antonio, and we lived with my grandmother. My grandmother, to set the stage, was born in 1911, and was born at a time when she and so many others did not have the right to vote, not only because she was African American, but if you do the math, also because she was born a woman. For 50 years, my grandmother was a maid. She had a 4th grade education. She was a maid. And I remember her telling me the stories, and she would tell me the stories of her life, not necessarily to bore me, but to set the stage of how fortunate we were, my sister and I, to be able to go to school. Every time I was like, I don't want to do my homework, she'd say, well, let me tell you what it was like for your grandfather and myself, and even my mother's older siblings who were born 20 years before my mother was, so they endured really some great hardships of the civil rights movement and integration. But what stuck with me was a story my grandmother told me. I was probably 11 at this point. She said, I don't know if you understand that I have never walked through the front door of the family's houses that I've worked for. And when I tell you that it blew me away, because I come from a very civic-minded family, and what I had always been told about my country is that it does not matter the color of your skin. It does not matter if you're rich or poor. All that matters is the breadth of your character. And for my grandmother, she was this stalwart. Just she could do no wrong. I mean, she was so great that every time I lied about stealing Oreos, she would turn that into a Bible story. I mean, she was everything I aspired to be, and I continue to aspire to be. And so that realization that prejudices and laws ran so abhorrently aghast to the country I had been told I lived in, and that so vehemently presented itself in my own family with this woman who was the matriarch of my family, made me question everything I knew, not only about my country, but about my faith. Because the first question that I asked, I'll never forget this, was not about the country. It was, well, Grandma, if God is real, why would he let that happen to you? Now, I was grounded for a week for questioning God, but that fostered a conversation. And so from that moment on, how I viewed faith and how I viewed politics and government and policy, even from that young age, was always intertwined. Because the question that I always had to ask myself was, if by virtue of when I place my hand over my heart, I say we're one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, yet this nation under God has seemingly denied my grandmother and my grandfather and my aunts and uncles liberty and justice. How does that conflict? How does that combine? And these were questions that I wrestled with, again, because in my household, I was the geeky kid who always on Sundays had to watch 60 Minutes. So I always had a presence of what the world was, what our leaders were talking about and doing. And conversely, my 5- and 4-year-old now also have to watch 60 Minutes. And so hearing, I have to pause and tell this story. It's a moment of parental and fatherly pride. Constitution Day was a couple of weeks ago, and my son's school had a talk about it. And the teacher was talking, and she said, well, we're going to elect our president this year. And I knew that was wrong, but I was like, hey, it's your world. I next year. But I know my kid, and so when I saw his little antennas go up, I was like, this is not going to play itself out well. And my son just stands up and says, and I'm not going to say the teacher's name because it's going on YouTube, but stands up and says, Miss So-and-so, we actually are electing our president next year. And I was like, oh, dude, I'm proud of you, and you are so going to Baskin Robbins after this, but in the present tense, I'm not sure that you are going to see recess for a little while. And she looked very confused, and she was like, well, Colmon, I think you're right. I think we are electing our governor this year. And he turns to me, and this is the smart aleck kid that I'm raising, gives me a virtual high five and wink at the same time. So this is the kind of kid that I'm raising, and this is the kind of environment that I grew up in, and thus my children are growing up in. And so you fast forward. So understanding how I've seen the world, understanding the role of faith, not only my own Christian faith, but my passion for understanding the faith walk of others. You fast forward to, I'm at Transylvania University. That's where I went for my undergrad. And I began to get involved in the political process. And I was probably 18 or 19 years old before I really understood the political party that I was going to be a part of. And it really wasn't by virtue of anything other than there were some core differences for me. And so I said, okay, not only am I going to choose to be a part of this political party, but I'm also not going to be passively a part of this party. And at a very early point in my political career, began to very strategically but unintentionally challenge some of the talking points of how my party talked about certain issues. So we could talk about housing, for instance, and you can make very policy-driven arguments about how we engage in housing, how the disparities of housing affect different people, different ways, different places, in not only in this Commonwealth, but across our nation. For me, the center point of why I believe that our government and our politics should focus on quality and affordable housing for everyone were two reasons. One, we moved to Kentucky. And the one thing that I have left out is we moved to Kentucky, and about 6 months after we moved to Kentucky, we were homeless. And we spent the next year homeless, living in the Evergreen Motel, living in our car, living in friends' homes where when my mother didn't really know how or where we were going to go. And so affordable housing for me was personal. But then I also went back to my own faith. And I said, you know, I'm pretty sure there's a directive to where we can engage very actively in housing the homeless. I believe that's a directive. And even if it's not explicitly written out, my default for some of the things, all of the things that I'm going to discuss this evening is that in which you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. And so if at our core we recognize that poverty is something that we don't know, there is no one in this room or anyone that you know that aspires to be poor. Now, I'm not saying that everyone aspires to be rich, but poverty, true poverty, is not something that we aspire to. And so when we see it and we recognize it and we understand that homelessness can be avoided, that hunger can be avoided, we are bound, I believe, to do something about it. And so my political career has been shaped by a belief that social justice is what we are called to do, not as Democrats or Republicans or independents, but as people as human beings. You know, my faith teaches me that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. If that is true, and I do believe that to be true, then you cannot look at your neighbor's face. You cannot look into your sister or brother's eyes and not recognize that there, but for the grace of God, you could be that person that's living under the bridge. You could be that person who has been evicted from their home. You could be that person who does not understand or contemplate where their next meal is coming from. That is how I've seen my role in this discourse that we call politics. And so it was funny to me that as I began my career and as my career kind of took off politically, I have Democrats coming up to me and saying, hey, you're talking about faith way too much out there. Like, dial it back. This isn't church. And I have Republicans come to me and say, are you sure you're a Democrat? Because you talk about faith a lot and you're using this as a church. And the only thing I can say to all of them is, you're both wrong. Like, a church isn't the four walls. And we are called to, where we see inequity, where we see injustice, where we see a wrong, speak to what's right. That's how I've seen the role. And honestly, as more people paid attention to me, I just viewed it as a bigger platform to continue to talk about these things and to not change how I talked about them. And so the question for me has always been, what is our role as people of faith in taking on these issues? I've talked about homelessness. It's something that's very personal to me, but it is also something that no matter where you live in Kentucky, no matter where you live in this country, it is at an epidemic state. And you look at the faces of the homeless, and I remember saying this one time that, you know, homelessness looks a lot of ways to a lot of different people, but let's take away the notion that it's somebody living in a tent. If you were to follow me back home to Georgetown right now, and I could take you to the Knights Inn, if you go to the back of the Knights Inn, there are about 10 to 15 units that are full of families right now who are homeless, who are living there either by the goodwill of the owner or are piecing together the bare minimum to stay there day in and day out. These are people that aren't working. These are people who are just looking for a handout. These are families whose mothers and fathers go to work every day. These are little boys and little girls who don't know any better. When we were homeless, we just thought it was an adventure. We knew it was different, but kind of going each different place every night was fun for the first couple of weeks. And so the question is, do we look at that and just resign ourselves to the notion that, well, it happens and it's a shame, but who am I to step in and try to make a difference? Or do we say, through our political process, but also through our activism, and I don't mean political activism, I mean activism within our church. One of the reasons that I joined, and our family joined Good Shepherd, was we went there on a test run. Most people find churches in one of two ways. Either you were born in that church and you're going to die in that church, or you go on a test run and it sticks. So my wife and I had gone to all kinds of churches. Victoria was raised in the Catholic Church. As I said, I was too. We then had children. And if you've ever been to a church that is not welcoming of children, the following happens. The moment your kid does anything remote, it doesn't have to be even like pass gas. It could be they cry because they're hungry and it's early. You always know what kind of church you're in by how people turn around. So we had gone to churches heretofore where the people who turn around like this. Good Shepherd was the last place. We were like, look, if they look at us this way when we go there, we're just going to dial it in and watch church on TV. Colmon, or Carter, our youngest, we sit down, Carter starts crying. And there's a woman, Joy, who is just so great with children. And we got scared. We were like, oh gosh, here it comes. And at the same time that he started crying, I'm pretty sure, I don't know this for gospel truth, but I'm pretty sure there's a dirty diaper involved in there too. I've kind of blocked it out, but I'm pretty sure there was. And she, instead of shunning us, said, well, here, let me take it. We were done. We were there. Victoria cried. Dan all the way home, sitting at Sonny's barbecue. We went, I don't even know why, because I'm a vegan, but we were there. And I was like, oh, this water tastes so good. It tastes like barbecue. But that's how we found Good Shepherd. But why we stayed was even more because we're looking through the newsletter, and the first thing we see is this thing called Church Under the Bridge. And we asked, we're like, what's Church Under the Bridge? Like, do we all just congregate under the church one day a week? And we began to understand that there was a ministry not of shunning those who are homeless, shunning those who have fallen on hard times, but actually going and doing what God would tell us to do, which is to go among. And not just talk about being people of faith. You will always find me saying, I hate when people talk about being people of faith. Talk is cheap. And you have never converted anybody by just saying it. It's about our actions. It's about showing that we live the tenets of our faith. So with homelessness, do we have a responsibility? Yes, we do. And not only through government responses, but as parishioners, as churches, as citizens, we have a responsibility if we claim the mantle of being a person of faith, whether that is Christianity, Judaism, Baha'i, Buddhism, Islam, there are in all of those faiths and so many more, we are all connected by a tenet that says, if you see suffering, do all that you can to ease it or eradicate it. The same thing with hunger. I often tell the story about hunger. This body is about 6 years old. So if you had known me before 6 years ago, there was about 300 more pounds of me. And I was always a big kid. For having been homeless and poor, I found ways to eat. And I often tell the story that my sister and I weren't necessarily ever looking for meals. But we watched our mother look for meals. We watched our mother lie to our faces, and we knew that it was a lie. Every time she said, I just had a big lunch, so you all eat. That was code for, there's only enough for the two of you, and I need to make sure that you all are okay. And so, again, from a very, very visceral level, I feel inclined to say, do we have an obligation where we know there is hunger, where we understand that there are children and families and people, no matter how they got there, that are hungry? If you have ever seen a child in class not be able to focus, so many times we can say that child is just a problem child, but if you ask that child, did you eat this morning? 9 times out of 10, the answer is probably going to be no. And it's not that they're bad and they're not focusing, they're hungry. And I'll tell you, you can ask me what 2 plus 2 is, but if I'm hungry, I don't care about the answer being 4. But even as a Christian, I will tell you, when I came into the governor's office, I asked what our responses were to certain things, and one of those was hunger. And were we partnering with food banks, especially across the Commonwealth, not only in times of great emergency, but in just normal times? And got a pretty good answer. Like, we do okay, not nearly enough. And someone asked me and said, Colmon, you've got a big interest in this. Like, what are you going to run for office? Like, what's the issue? And I very just succinctly said, there are certain things that if I see Christ having done, I then feel it is my job to emulate. So if, by virtue of this argument, there were the masses, and there was a loaf of bread and some fish, and then he fed the masses from a loaf of bread and a couple of fish, that's code word for, hey, feed the masses with a bread and a couple of fish, and your bread might be limited budget, and the fish might actually be fish, but you have an obligation to make sure that where you can, the hungry are fed. And so, yes, I very unapologetically directed a lot of resources, personally and professionally, to make sure that where we could, we were exceeding what certain communities are, what many communities said was needed, because you never know. And the worst thing that I found is that we we often feel like, if we take this can of food in that we're not going to eat anyway, that we've done our job. But if you're not going to eat it, what makes you think so? Like, being hungry doesn't make you any less picky. I don't like mashed potatoes. And so when we go to food banks and they'd be like, well, we have mashed potatoes and gravy tonight, I'm like, I will pass. And no one could understand why I would pass, but the truth is I could eat it and like literally like throw it up, or you could give me some green beans and we'd be great. And so I was very insistent that we needed to make sure that, I always used to use the term, I want to see in food bank what I see in my own pantry. And so if Kool-Aid Squeeze-Its are good enough for my kids, they're good enough for the kid that I may never meet but deserves to have the dignity of being a child and seeing in that food bank things that they would see their friends have. We made a decision during my time in the governor's office about health care. And I'm not going to get into the politics of that decision. What I'll tell you is when the Affordable Care Act was passed, now you have to understand the governor, if you don't know, Steve Beshear, was an attorney general and lieutenant governor and a lawyer by trade, and so I tend to trust his thought process about the Constitution. When he made the decision, I remember we were on a plane and he was talking to me about it, and I said, like, I'm with you, but I'm telling you, like, all of your political capital is gone. Like, it's my duty to tell you what the world's going to look like when you go out and you make this statement. And he said, okay. He said, but Colmon, you're the religious guy. So I'm kind of confused. And I said, oh, no, don't conflate the two. I actually believe you should do this, but I have to tell you, in all honesty, what's going to be said. And so we're sitting around and we're talking about it, and he said, no, Colmon, you've told me your political analysis. Tell me how you really feel. And I said, Governor, I'm going to tell you the same thing that I would tell anyone who would question this. And again, this is where my faith colors my thought process about social justice, and I will make the loop of why I believe access to health care is a social justice issue. I said, Governor, the God I serve made the blind see and the lame walk, and even raised a man or two from the dead. And never once did he ask if they were in his provider network. So, do what you gotta do. Like, that was my view on that policy issue. It was very clear to me that that is what we are called to do. Now, why? For that reason. That as people of faith, if we ascribe to the belief set that, again, we are all created in the image and likeness of our Creator, that fact comes with one trump card. And that is that you, no matter your stripes, no matter what you look like, no matter where you come from, no matter if you were born with means or not, you are entitled to dignity. Entitled to dignity. Everyone wants to talk about entitlements and what they feel about that. You are entitled, by virtue of your creation, to dignity. I watched my mother stress when my sister and I would cough, that a cough would just be a cough, because she understood that she could not afford to take time off of work if we were sick, and could not afford any bills that would come with us being sick. And I watched her lose dignity every single time she would pray that it wouldn't be bad. I also, now, I've lost my father already. I also almost lost my mother because of the lack of access to quality and affordable health care. When I was 14 years old, my mother got pneumonia. And she's so stubborn. We have established that she is stubborn and somewhat crazy. But she was so stubborn that she would not go to the doctor. She would not go to the hospital. And it finally got so bad that she was drifting in and out of consciousness. And so the only doctor that I knew was a veterinarian. The only doctor I knew, like, that I actively knew the number to, So I called Dr. Brzezinski, and I said, Dr. Brzezinski, my mom is sick, and I think you need to come to the house. And he laughed, and he said, you do understand that while technically we are all part of the animal kingdom, your mother is not. You're not my clientele. And I said, yeah, but I think she'll listen to you. When he got there, now, let me paint the picture. Dr. Brzezinski is about 6'7", and 300 and so odd pounds, and a big burly guy. When he got there and he went into my mother's room, he turned around, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a grown man cry. And he got himself together and he said, Colmon, where's your sister? And I said, she's in the other room. And he said, send her outside and call the ambulance. And he gave me my marching orders because he understood the gravity of the situation and understood that if I ran out with all kinds of alarms, it was going to freak my little sister out. I got that. Tell me that not being able to afford quality and affordable health care, access, believing that you are not even worthy to call a doctor when you know you need it, is not abhorrent to everything we ascribe to as people of faith. I'm reminded that when Jesus was traveling throughout with his disciples, that there were people that would carry the lame in, and they would feel unworthy, but he never shunned them. He never turned them away. And so, in so many regards, that is what we are called to do. Where people feel, because of the social constructs that we have created, that they are unworthy, we as people of faith have to create almost alternate constructs that say, yes, you are. We have to ascribe to that notion, come as you are. It's not just a Nirvana song. It is actually Scripture. Come as you are. Because you are worth that dignity. You are born with that dignity. And so, yes, it has colored the totality of my career. And the things that I've engaged in, both politically and in governing, have all come down to that very notion that as a person of faith, the world as it is cannot continue if I have a role to play. Now the question is, what do we do without titles behind our names, without the ability to mobilize government forces and all of these things at our disposal? You do what you're doing tonight. You engage in conversations about our role as people of faith in the world, how we engage. One of the things that I told the governor when we came in, and I came in with him the day after my 26th birthday, was that I could not hang up being a Christian when I walked through the doors of 700 Capitol Avenue, which is the address to our state capital. I said, if that's an expectation, then I can quit now. And to his credit, he never asked me to do that. But in a real way, I had been doing that my entire life. I had gone to school and engaged in these conversations, both in middle school and high school and college and graduate school. Almost every organization that I'm a member of, whether it's Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky, which I'm on the board of, or any number of the other organizations, they've all been around this idea that how we join together to answer the needs of people matters. And again, it's not about talking about our faith. For me, faith is an action verb. It does no good if you are just talking about it. It only operates if we are continuously showing its value and its worth and its power through action, activism, and results. I began where I'm going to end. And that's talking about my grandmother. And I probably could have mentioned this and it maybe would have made a lot more sense. My grandmother was the first person ever to tell me the story about my father, who was born in Alabama. And so my grandmother on my mother's side was born in San Antonio, and that's who I talked about. But my grandmother also, obviously because my parents were married, knew a lot about my father. And my father was born in 1939 in Birmingham, Alabama. And I remember when she would talk to me about the civil rights movement, and she would talk to me about her experiences. The moment she told me the story about my father going at risk to himself and my uncle to the March on Washington, I get emotional when I talk about it because my grandfather, my father's father, did not want my father to go. He understood the dangers of driving from Birmingham, Alabama to Washington, D.C. And so my grandfather, the way my grandmother tells the story, is that he made my father an offer that he was almost certain he would refuse. My grandfather told my father that he could go only if he took my uncle. Well, my father was older, and they notoriously did not get along. And so, believing that my father would say no to this, my grandfather thought it was settled. But they went. And knowing that he risked so much to be there, I said, well, Grandma, did he ever tell you why he felt it was important to be there? Because it's not like what we have now. It's not like he got on Twitter and everyone was like, this is going to be the craziest thing in the world. You've got to get there. There had to be a sense of purpose to be there. And my grandmother looked at me and she said, Colmon, go look in the mirror. And I said, okay. The way her house was set up, there was a mirror right off of their living room. And she said, Colmon, he went for you. He went because he understood the way the world was. But he wanted to be involved in something that would change the world so that you could have something better. And he waited a long time for you. If you do the math, my father was born in 1939, I was born in 1981. She said he waited a long time for you. But everything that he did was so that you could have every opportunity to be who you wanted to be. If you look at the civil rights movement, that is the linchpin, I think, of how we as people of faith engage in social justice. And all the things that I've talked about tonight were a part of that movement. It was not just about racial equality. It wasn't about just the integration of schools and the integration of the highways and byways, as Dr. King would say. If you remember when he was assassinated, it wasn't racial integration he was talking about. It was fair wages for sanitation workers. What made him a thorn in the side of so many was not necessarily only his work on racial issues, but it was his abhorring the war in Vietnam. And as much as he talked about his 4 little children growing up in a world where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, he talked about a poor people's campaign, where we could talk about these issues of housing inequality, of homelessness, of hunger. All of these things make up what we think about as social justice. Because all of these things, access to education, access to healthcare, access to housing, access to food, all speak to what we value as a society. And if we value these things, if we place dollar cents and time and money and energy on these things, then it cannot be just good enough for those who have. It has to be the right of all, because organizations that we are involved in, our ability to engage as active citizens, yes, can be seen through a political lens. As much as my life has been defined by politics, I actually hate the current state of politics. I hate that faith has become a political football to divide us when it should be the one thing that we come together and say, no matter our faith beliefs, certain tenets, the majority of tenets, give us marching orders of how we should operate. But politics aside, you, and I want to speak especially to the students that are here, even at your age, there is no excuse to just pass off responsibility to someone else. Where you see injustice, you must speak up. And not only speak up, but with your hands and your feet and all that you are, seek to make it right. There is a way that I always end speeches, and it's not that I'm phoning it in, but I'm led to say it. We have a responsibility to shape the future we inherit. We do. And that doesn't mean that you can just wait until a fever pitch. It means being actively engaged enough to avoid those catastrophic moments. How we avoid a Katrina response, how we avoid homelessness and poverty, how we avoid people of color being targeted unfairly. Because, look, I'll be the first to tell you, I don't ascribe necessarily to all of the things that you see in the media, but for all the roles that I've had in my life, I still get followed when I go to the mall. I get followed when I go to the mall. Because I'm not in a suit and tie. I'm in jeans and cowboy boots, and apparently that's code for he's going to rob us. But lo and behold, I will tell you that in times that has happened, it's been my wife who happens to be white. It's been other people who happen to look different than I that say, hey, they speak up. They don't sit idly by. They speak up. They see this and understand that, hey, I'm not going to pick a fight. Like, I'm just going to pay for what I'm going to. Usually I overcompensate and buy way too much stuff to then prove I could shop there. My wife told me that was wrecking our bank account, so she said, I'm just going to say something. I think I told a group of young men, my wife is not given to speaking publicly a lot. So when she does, it's like an act of God in Congress, and it is God's intervention, because then she's like, where did that come from? She's like, she didn't speak up because she loves me, because she's my wife, and because somehow through wedding vows she felt a responsibility to say something. Because I know she would do that for anyone. As people of faith, we are not called to be passively existent. We are called from the day we are born until the day that we die to be actively engaged in ensuring that all that faith teaches us is borne out in the communities and society, or in the communities that we reside in and the society that we aspire to be. I fear I've gone on too long, but I want to again thank you all for engaging in these conversations. They tell us that we as a generation, and I'm a millennial too, I'm the older side of the millennials, but I still am one. They tell us that we are apathetic, that we are disengaged. I read poll after poll and study after study that tells me that we are the least religiously affiliated generation. And every time I read those things, I just want to call the people, and I have done this sometimes, call the people who write them or call the people who conducted the polls and say, have you met a millennial? Or did you just Google something and then put it out there? It's not that we aren't engaged in our faith, we just aren't terrorizing people about it. I look around and I see young men and women who are actively engaged in their faith. And while we're not beating people over the heads and evangelizing that way, we are building homes, we are volunteering, we are speaking truth to power in ways that define who we are, because our faith has been the definition of how we see the world. So my parting response to you is to keep doing what you're doing. If people are nervous, it means you're doing something right. If you're shaking up the system, keep doing it. Because our responsibility is not to solve all the world's problems. It is to leave the communities that we are part of, here at the University of Kentucky, here in Lexington, in your hometowns, as they are now or where they might be. Leave those communities a little better for having the privilege to have been born into them. That's our responsibility. So thank you again for letting me be a part of this conversation. I hope I didn't bore you. If you have questions, I think we'll get going. That works for me. All right. That was a lot and it didn't make any sense, so you're all just like,
Well, the floor is open for questions. Don't everyone jump up at once. We've got a couple. All right, great.
Well, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you knew of any authors or movements that are going on right now that are helping articulate or shape the with more direction, this idea of faith and social justice.
So I will let me just say, not off the top of my head, and the reason for that isn't that I don't read about it. It's more that I personally I'm just a part of it. So again, me and my family very purposely choosing the place of worship that we go to was very specific, because not only was it inviting to our family, but because they're engaged in social justice activities. And again, some of the organizations I think that we are a part of kind of piecemeal it, so they may focus on one thing or the other. What I will say is I talked about housing, and there's a program in Nashville called 100,000 Homes, and it's a very powerful kind of movement, because on the policy side, what they've done is they partnered with landlords of apartments and things like that. And they said, hey, if you can dedicate 2 or 3 of your units to our homeless population, that would be a great thing. And by and large, they've gotten a great buy-in from the community. But when you hear people talk about kind of how this all began, it began because of people of faith getting together and saying, we see this crisis in our community. What's our responsibility? How can we mobilize and act? And so I am sure there are, and I would probably wake up in the middle of the night and I should have said that. But what I will tell you is, for me, it is seeing people of faith figure out creative ways to engage in these issues, and that's just one example of people of faith just saying, hey, look, we've got a responsibility, and it's out of hand. One of the more traumatic things, as you can imagine, I spent a lot of time in Washington, and I don't know if you've ever walked around in Washington, D.C. at night. It is, for me, one of the most, as a person of faith and as a person tasked with government, one of the most breathtaking realities of how greatly we have failed. you see men and women and children of all hues, of all backgrounds, many who have served this nation, homeless, begging for food and shelter, and our nation seemingly not having a response to them. And I remember I was in D.C. when Pope Francis was there. And I was sitting at dinner with some folks, and there's a $1 to donuts. This man's going to go out and talk to the homeless. And I was like, why are we betting on that? Like, it's Pope Francis. Of course he's like, the question is, where is he going? And is anybody going to know he's coming there when he comes? Like, it's not a question. Like, if you know Pope Francis, you know this is coming. But what was interesting in those conversations was how it was kind of this, oh, well, why? The tenor of the conversation was, we really don't want him to do it because it's going to show how badly we're not doing our job. And I thought, you know, I hope he comes, and I hope his press person brings every camera imaginable. Because that's kind of, you know, if you go in there, it's kind of like our dirty little secret. We all know it exists, but we're just not going to talk about it. My mother would always say, I'm looking for the person who named their child they. Because you always hear, they will do that, they'll do that. My mother's a smart aleck, but she was, you know, it's a very valid point. Like, in the absence of just abandoning responsibility, we've got to accept responsibility. And so, again, that question will haunt me, and I will wake up in the middle of the night and be like, oh, there's like 4 or 5, and then I will email Dana, and then he will email you, or we can just Google it.
What was the Nashville program?
100,000 homes.
100,000. Okay, thank you.
Felt like there was none.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wanted to know how you reconciled aspects of your political affiliations that conflict with your personal beliefs. Yeah.
Quite simply, actually. I'm a Democrat, but being a Democrat does not define me. And so there will always be, just by virtue of it being a national party, there will always be parts of the party's platform and belief set that I totally will go and fight tooth and nail for, and others that I'm like, okay guys, well, you know, y'all can go talk about that. I'm gonna be over here, and there are times that we agree to disagree. So I don't know that it's a reconciling so much as it is I can only be who I am. And so when I was leading the Young Democrats of America, for instance, you know, I did that for 5 years. And I know, I mean, you know, there were folks from New York and California and some parts of Florida that were like, we believe you're a Republican. Like, we believe you finally infiltrated our organization and you're going to tear it down. And honestly, it was not a political motive that led me to talk about certain things the way that I talked about them. It was, guys, you all have to realize the world is bigger. And if we're going to be this big tent party, there's got to be room for differing opinions and differing life forms. And so really, it's not that I reconcile it so much as I just say, this is who I am. And, you know, that there are a ton of issues that my party and I don't see eye to eye on. The difference is, and you didn't ask this, but I do want to say this, the difference is where there are disagreements, you will never hear me demonize anyone for those disagreements. And that, unfortunately, is the culture that we live in now, is that if we have disagreements, then you're just evil. You know, and that is the furthest thing from the truth. I just believe that, you know, I remember telling Chairwoman Schultz this one time. She asked me about something, and I was like, yeah, I can't go. I was being asked to go on cable news and defend something. I was like, I really can't do that. And you know, very politely, she said, well, why not? And I said, look, no one can consulted me when they were writing this part of the platform, therefore I don't need to go and defend this part of the platform. And, you know, that's a fair answer. Now, granted, no one consulted me when they were writing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution either, but by virtue of that, we didn't always get that right either. So, again, what I would say to you is, regardless of what your politics are, do not be defined by the party that you choose. And in fact, seek to keep redefining what that party is. Because at our best, as a politic, we should continue to have these conversations that grow our belief sets and ultimately more accurately define and inform how we make decisions, both politically and policy. So, I feel like that was a very political answer. I'm sorry. That goes, happens. Yes?
Okay, so given the fact that our country is founded on like freedom and like independency and stuff like that, my question is how you respond to the whole argument that these programs, like the health reform and the housing programs, take away the choice of people to manage their money in the way that they want to, and instead of like giving people the opportunity, encouraging them to donate to those things, like requiring them and not giving them that choice.
Well, I think there's a difference. You know, what my policy position always is that there has to be a middle ground. So there's almost always, in any of the programs that I've been responsible for or advocating for, there's always been a middle ground of matching the investing in someone who maybe has fallen on hard times with a requirement of personal responsibility. So we're just not going to give you, and you're just going to take, and you're not going to put in anything on this end. And so the greatest example for me is an organization that I was on the board on for about 5 or 6 years, the Family Scholar House. And the Family Scholar House provides housing free of charge to men and women and their children. The only requirement to get that housing for you and your child, which also comes with, you know, electricity and water and all this other stuff, is you have to be enrolled in college. Well, you know, we raised a lot of money to make sure that we could build apartment units, that we could do all of these things. But it's no easy thing to be a single parent and to go to college and to be actively participating in your education. And so what I would say is most programs, most social programs have that middle ground that you have to meet. I don't know if this is what you were asking too, but you know, as a taxpayer, what I would tell you is I have never minded, ever in my life, paying more in taxes if it means that we are meeting our moral responsibility to do those things that I talked about: feed the homeless, feed the hungry, house the homeless. You know, provide clothing to the naked. I mean, until I was about 30 years old, all my clothes came from the Goodwill, you know, and there was no prerequisite for me getting clothes from there. It was, hey, you show up and you pay $1.50 and you got a great shirt, you know. So those that would advocate that by the government investing in those programs, somehow that's taking away choice, again, my response really is, one, I actually view that as the role of government, and we could have a policy discussion on that. I mean, and that could take up a day, 2, or a week. You know, Congress can't even figure that out right now. So, you know, I ascribe to the notion that the role of government is in part to meet the needs of the people where they are. And so whether that is physically where they are or the state of which which they find their life, if we can, we should. And oftentimes we do. And I believe that most people, regardless of their politics, see that version of reality. I think it's more of, you know, you hear talk about a welfare state. I never really understood that. But you know, but I understand that it's based on this notion that a handful of people who have managed to do something wrong then paint the picture of everyone who actually needs it. And I'm reminded of our own walk. My mother, never forget this. My mother we've established stubborn, and but things got so bad that she actually humbled herself to go and try to get public assistance. And I remember the lead up to that. She didn't sleep, and she looked really bad. And because for her it was the admission that she had failed something. For her it was, not for us. We went there. My mother fills out everything. She took us with her, and she was told that she made too much because she worked 4 jobs. And so the lady actually told her, if you go and quit a job and come back, you'll qualify. My mother does not quit anything. So we continued to struggle. She kept her 4 jobs. That was a bad actor. That was somebody who said, I'm going to tell you how to cheat the system. And you're going to do it. The majority of people don't do that. And so I believe we do have not only a responsibility as a government, but a moral responsibility as a people to, again, use the resources that we're blessed with as a nation to meet the needs of our people where they are, with the notion that you have a responsibility and an opportunity because of that investment to better yourself. And 9 times out of 10, I'll tell you, my experience has been people rise to that challenge.
Backing away from politics for a little bit, and more just like promoting social justice, how did you go from talking the talk to walking the walk to the speak, and then how do you encourage others to go from the passive to the aggressive in that sense, or the action?
I went from talking the talk to walking the walk because I am an impatient person. And there was a sense that I had that I could wait for others, or I could do and again, as I said before, shake up the system. And so there's nothing more disconcerting to a bunch of people who believe they have control than a 15-year-old showing up to a city council meeting and talking about homelessness. Nothing more just, you know, because you watch people like, what? And you know, here I am with facts and figures and flip charts, and they're just like, well, we didn't know. I just got impatient. And so what I would tell you is 2 things. Do not force yourself to do it. Forcing yourself to do something that you're not ready for is setting yourself up for failure. It's akin to, I say, being a poser. You know, I mean, you have to be, and I believe this as a person of faith, that calling, you will know it when it comes. And for me, it was early in my life. And so what I would say is humble yourself to not only see the world around you and understand that it is imperfect, even for maybe some of the luxuries that you all have. Y'all have great dorms now. You know, I'm on the board at Transy, and I hear students there, you know, whine, and really it's whining about the accommodations they have now in the new dorms. And I'm like, guys, I was 300 pounds and I had to walk up 4 flights of stairs every day. Stop whining. Y'all got an elevator. Like, you know, I mean, it's just things like that. So, you know, humble yourself to see the world as it is around you and wait for that burning. There will be a moment where the light switch goes off and you understand that you can't sit down anymore until you start doing something. And so until that burning comes, you just become a sponge and you absorb what the world is, and you understand the inequalities that exist. You understand the great things. Not all in the world is bad. And all of those things form your opinion, but the moment that you find that something that sparks you, then you know you have the power within you to start speaking. And you don't have to be eloquent. You don't have to deliver monologues. You don't have to get up. All you have to do is find a foot, a door and a foot, and firmly put your foot in that door and say, this is where I'm going to start. And where you start may change. You may start here as a student at UK, but then you graduate. And then you go back home, or your career takes you someplace else, and then you all of a sudden have to find a new place to find that footing again. But you understand now that it's in you to find it. And you understand now that just because you moved a certain place, that doesn't mean the inequalities have stopped at a border's edge. And so really, the moment Fannie Lou Hamer famously said, you'll get sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I got sick and tired of watching the news and seemingly having leaders be apathetic to the world as it was. And when you find yourself being sick and tired of being sick and tired, there is nothing else to do than to do something. And you will find yourself critical of yourself. I left the governor's office 2 months ago. My wife will tell you, the sleep that I have lost has been because I, for the first time, when you're in it, you're in it. But for the first time, I've been able to kind of dissect these past 8 years. And I can go down the laundry list of things that I feel like I just didn't do. And I will, because you never know if you're going to, that was my one shot, as far as I'm concerned. And so I found myself going and apologizing to a lot of the organizations and a lot of the people personally. And they all are very kind. They always say, oh, Colmon, you did more than anybody could have expected you to do. But you'll find yourself being harder on yourself, and that's how you know you're active, that you are not just talking the talk, but you're walking the walk. Do you have?
I was just wondering, as people not as part of like a governmental office or anything, like what would you say is like the number one thing we could do to get involved and influence like policy decisions as people with no actual official political power?
Well, let me answer your question by totally rejecting the premise of your question. As people, as citizens, you have the greatest political power. I got my job not because I knew somebody, not because I put tons of money. I didn't have any money. I mean, when the governor asked me to come on board, we literally had a couch. We had bought a house, but we were naive enough to believe that love was just going to take us there. So we had a couch and a college refrigerator, not even a big people refrigerator. And we had pretty much spent the week eating at Taco Bell. That paints the picture of my life before I got into the governor's office. We were both looking for jobs. Victoria was finishing graduate school. I had just finished graduate school. I got my job not because I knew somebody or because I had money, I had a famous last name. I got my job because I was a citizen first, because I saw certain things and I said, I've got to do something. I've got to be a part of this process. And yes, I've been and grown in the Democratic Party, but even my Democratic friends will tell you that, where I first made a name for myself was when I was a college student at Transylvania University. And sanitation workers here in Fayette County were trying to get an adjustment in their pay. They wanted to be classified as hazardous duty because so many of them had been hit by cars. There were so many that had been maimed by the machinery. And how I made my mark, how anybody started to realize who Colmon Elridge was when I got up at the city council meeting and spoke on their behalf. No one asked me to do it, But I saw what was happening, and I knew it was coming up, and I said, you know, it was that burning desire that I talked to you about. I was sitting in my dorm room in Clay Hall at Transylvania University, and I just said, if I don't speak, if I don't say something, I'm never going to forgive myself. I'm never going to look at myself in the mirror. And the world changed for me after that, because my mother called me. This is how I knew I felt like I was in trouble, but the world had changed. My mother called me and she said, why have 5 people called me and told me that you were on the 6 o'clock news? And I was like, I don't know why I was on the 6 o'clock news. And it wasn't until the 10 o'clock news on Fox 56, I watched the 10 o'clock news and I was like, oh my gosh. And the next day I got a call from the head of the group that was advocating for the sanitation workers, and she said, you know, we spent about 10 hours trying to track you down. Where did you come from? Who sent you? And I said, no, I came from Cynthiana, Kentucky, and no one sent me. And that's how I make my mark. So I would tell you that you right now, how old are you?
20?
Where are you from?
Louisville?
Okay, not gonna hold that against you. What high school did you go to, by the way?
Brown?
Okay, my wife went to Fern Creek. I always have to ask that. That's apparently what matters when you talk to somebody from Louisville. Is that you, as a 20-year-old from Louisville, who graduated from Brown, who is a student here at the University of Kentucky, have the power to elect people or to ceremoniously uninvite them from their jobs. You have all the power. And so when you speak, it may seem that no one's listening, but I guarantee you someone is listening. And maybe it's not, you know, the governor. Maybe it's not the representative. But I guarantee you, you speak, and you speak with, you know, you are consistent with your advocacy. There's a staffer who's going to say, we got a problem at the University of Kentucky. There's this kid from Louisville who's 20, and he's been talking about this issue, and people are starting to listen to him. What are we going to do? And then they go into crisis mode. And all the while, you're like, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. So never underestimate the power of your voice. I always tell people, imagine if Martin Luther King Jr. would have thought because he was too short that no one would care about what he said. Or Mother Teresa, or Gandhi. I mean, these are people who did not have the stature of a government office, a political affiliation. It was all about social justice. So, and consequently, Martin Luther King delivered his first sermon on social justice at 15. Now, I'm not saying go get ordained and give a sermon. I'm saying you have the power. And as I said earlier, never wait for an invitation. If I was to wait for an invitation to be involved, I'd still be waiting. I still would. I mean, I can be frank and honest with you. I'm not from Kentucky. I'm African American. I'm young. If you knew the amount of people who told me that who look at me and they say one of two things. Either one, I got where I am because of affirmative action, or two, you are so bright. Which is code for you're brighter than the other people that look like you that we wouldn't think are. And somebody who looks like me is never going to get the invitation. Never. For 8 years, I sat in the governor's office. I was the only African American on the senior staff. The only. The youngest, by far. If I was going to wait for an invitation, I'd still be working at Walmart. Which was a great job, by the way. I mean, like, you know, I got a lot of sales stuff, but it was not what I aspired to be in my life. So you don't wait. And when you feel that fire, you speak. And then you shake up the system. Change the world. You get to come here and talk. Yes, sir.
As a person of faith, what advice would you like to have given to a governor or to the federal judge regarding county clerks who have trouble?
I was waiting for this. And then I thought I wasn't going to get it, and I was like, yes. You know, before I left the governor's office, preserve the dignity and the dignity that I was afforded, to not have to hang up my faith at the door of the place that I was privileged to serve. And so from that perspective, we always have to be respectful, and again, not tolerate, but respectful of and engaging in a dialogue with people of faith who we may have disagreements with. The difference, I believe, is, and this was the standard that I held myself to, so I can't hold anyone else to the same standard. But as I have talked about being a person of faith and in that role, I never allowed my faith to stop me from doing things that I was bound to do by law. And so for me, that was always the linchpin. That if I believed that there was some law that I had to enforce, or that I had to be a part of designing or talking about, that was so going to infringe upon, I just extricated myself from that. And so I don't know that I would have any advice. I can just say from my experience, and of course the difference for me also was I wasn't elected and I didn't take an oath. So there was a great deal of leeway that I had that I think by law elected officials do not have. But what I would say, and what I have said about this, as I've tried, trust me, this is the topic of, no matter where I go, this is the topic of conversation. You're from Kentucky? Well, let's talk about the county colors. Is showmanship aside, and I think there was showmanship on both sides. People of faith have to have a comfort level of being able to be who they are. And the citizens of every state of this nation have to have a comfort level with knowing that they will not be discriminated against because of that one person's faith. And how we walk that walk is something that we have been grappling with since the founding of this nation. And we will continue to. I heard a presidential candidate say that a Muslim should never be president. Well, you know, I have a feeling that before all said and done, we're going to have one. And there's going to be some decisions that are going to be made. And the question is always going to be, was that decision, it's like JFK. You know, I mean, I'm sure to this day there are people who believed before he was elected that he would answer to Rome, and 50 years after he was assassinated, still believe that during the 3 years of his presidency, every decision he made was made by the Pope. You're just not going to be able to rationally have those conversations with some people. But the two are not mutually exclusive. So you know, that was one of those things. I'll tell you that from a very selfish point, I was glad I was gone when it hit the fan. I was really glad that I wasn't getting the midnight phone calls from the press or from other people. But you know, I can only say that showmanship aside, people of faith should serve, should aspire to serve, should run for office, should not abandon their faith, but also have to understand that we are a nation of laws, and those mean something. And we just the thing that upsets me the most, and I'm not saying this was the case in those two instances, but so many times in the political fray, what you hear is, when I don't have a good answer for this, I'm just going to say that my faith doesn't let me do it. And unfortunately, our history is filled with those instances, and many of them didn't work out too well. You know, when my grandparents in Alabama had their business burned by the Klan said, that God created them lesser than, and so they were doing God's will. I never read in the Bible where just because of the color of your skin or your gender you were created lesser than, but apparently that was a marching order of the Ku Klux Klan. And I don't pretend to read into their hearts to believe that they believed otherwise. I take them at face value that they believe their religious conviction was go burn the Elridge's lumberyard down. But something tells me that our better angels know better. And, we just have to do better. We just have to. And this is not easy. If this were easy, anybody would do it. But figuring out how we as people of faith live and breathe and serve is important. And I do hope one of the outcomes is that more people of faith step up. I don't want less people of faith to step up and serve. I want more people. And then we can continue this dialogue as to what it means to be a person of faith. And maybe do something, as this young lady asked, that may be incongruent with what your political beliefs are, what the law says. What then is our role?
Just looking at the time.
Can I do
think
one
we've
more?
got time for one more question, and then
I will stick around, because my kids are
stick
asleep.
around.
Yes,
Thank you. It's a
with the awesome shirt. Yes.
Thank you. It's a two-part question. In your work with government the past 8 years, have you addressed the issue of payday lending and the exorbitant interest rates? Could you speak to that?
That was, so my first two assignments in the governor's office was the governor's prayer breakfast, which I didn't even touch on that. Changing that to a truly interfaith event was a very interesting process. But the other was payday lending. Again, personally, my life had been affected by that. Watching my mother having been thought she was doing something that was responsible, and the predatory practices are just shameful and immoral. And so we did engage in very early on with a policy initiative that had been adopted by the military. That was to cap, they can charge, they're charging 500 and up, 900% interest. Our policy was, let's see if we can get that to 36%, which was exactly what the military cap was. And the mentality was, one, if it's good enough for the military, we think it's good enough for the people who are being preyed upon. But the other was the belief that this had already gone through. And so it's one of those things that from a policy standpoint, you say, well, this has already gone through, and you all already know what the wording is, so this should be pretty easy. And when I tell you that, in fact, it was not easy, and in fact, it still has not been done, that was one of those things. That was on top of the list of things that I really turned to that group of interfaith leaders that first brought the subject to my attention and have been working passionately on this. My first apologies went to them because to this day, there are still families that are being destroyed by these predatory practices. And we have a legislature, not only in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, but across the nation, that are extraordinarily apathetic. And I would even go so far, because I'm not there anymore, to say that, quite frankly, they're being bought off by the payday lending industry, who either donates to their campaigns or threatens to donate to their opponents. And so, again, the worst form of leadership is the leadership that passively sits by because you don't want you don't want bad things to happen to you. And that's so yes, that's something that I will tell you with whatever platform I have, I've continued to advocate because it's just we've got to rein it in.
Okay,
Part
thank
two.
you. And then part two, since you said you continue to advocate, are you now, or if you aren't, would you consider working with there's interfaith organizations trying to address this right now, and working hard on it, and meeting the very thing you're talking about, that kind of resistance, people blocking these efforts, lobbyists, yeah, you know how that goes. Anyway, Clout in Louisville,
Yes.
Bill
And
here in
Clout was-
Lexington, are you familiar with them and do you work with them?
Oh, absolutely.
You do?
Clout was actually the first organization that I met with on this issue, and went several times to their assemblies to talk about this issue, and as I always said, to do more listening than talking, because at the end of the day, we knew what the policy fix was. So my talking about it was preaching to the choir. It was listening to the stories of families, listening to the stories of the activism of these groups, and then figuring out really a small p political strategy to galvanize the people power to match the financial power. And I think what's happened is, unfortunately, it's been muted by other things. But I will tell you, in Kentucky, I think we're at an opportune time because, in a week and a half, we're going to have a new governor. Next year, the legislature is going to come back in, but they're all up for re-election next year. And I think building this as an issue by which candidates understand you will be judged and you will be voted for or against is powerful if we can mobilize the people and the energy and, no pun intended, the statewide clout to hammer in that message. And I believe it's possible. Money doesn't always win the day. It doesn't always win the day. And I've always said about politicians, they have to be, it's a lot like my 5-year-old. I mean, I try to get him to do the right thing, and every once in a while I have to just assure him that doing the right thing isn't going to hurt him. So when I tell him he has to drink milk instead of chocolate milk, it's not because I don't like chocolate milk, it's because sometimes you just have to have it without the sugar. It's kind of the same thing with politicians, if you do the right thing, we're going to back you up. And you're not going to lose your office, you're not going to, and even if you do, okay. But we've got your back. And on this issue, I think it's been harder because the payday lending industry is so powerful and has so much money. Money, again, made on the backs of hardworking people. But it's possible and it's doable. And what I've told them all of the groups that you've talked about, is that we just have to be insistent and consistent until we get it done. And look, 36% is still too high. I still believe that. But I believe you take what you can get and then you go back for more. And I think once you get to 36% and the world doesn't collapse, then you go back and say, okay, let's make this more fair. And there's a way to make it fair to the industry and fair to the borrowers. And yes, the industry's going to lose some money, but they're still going to be confident. They can still go on their $1 million vacation. They're going to be fine. Even at 10%, they're still going to be fine. So, and studies have shown that. So yes, even though I don't have an office in government right now, the great part of my role now as the director of the National Center of Interstate Compacts and Collaboration is the masochistic part of me has traded in one governor for 53, and they all have my number and they all call. But the policy-driven social justice part of me now has a 53 state /territory laboratory. And so all of these things that I believe in and all of these things I advocate for, I now get to sit down with leaders of all parties and all states and territories and say, have you thought about doing this? And this is one of those things that in December when we have our annual meeting is at the top of the list. So I've exceeded, I feel like I'm in Congress and I'm just, sorry.
Well, actually, reception. For those of you who are visiting the chapel for the first time, welcome. If you would like to sign up for more information about our events and our activities, please do so at the table back there. I believe a survey was handed out. Was the survey handed out?
Just told people to take it. So.
You just told people to take it. If you took one, please fill it out. And if you didn't, please stop and get one to fill it out. It helps us gauge the success of our activities and better ways to do outreach for the next one. Our next chapel talk will be on November 5th. It is a follow-up event about marriage equality. Now that that's gone from a pressing issue to a reality, we're going to be talking about how the church responds to that new reality with Pastor Marcia Moores Charles. So that's November 5th at 8 o'clock with a meal preceding, and you're all invited to that. And then, of course, everyone here is also invited next week if you want to come. We're going to have a wonderful Halloween celebration. I realized this week that sometimes I feel like we're the eat your vegetables kind of campus ministry, putting on these talks, but I hope tonight has been informative, and we do have fun events as well. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to send Colmon off with a prayer, and you as well. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for the freedom to gather in this place, for the ministry of St. Augustine's Chapel, for the students who gather here for worship, for the board members and the donors that make this place possible. Lord, we give you thanks as well for Colmon, for his inspiring comments this evening. Please watch over him and guide him, and let his words inspire us to pursue your own calling on our lives, to pursue justice and walk humbly with our God. Lord, as we leave this place, watch over each one of us and allow us to return home safely. We ask these things in the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen.
Amen.